September 3rd marks the 75th anniversary of the victory of the Chinese People's War of Resistance against Japanese aggression and the end of World War II. The country is holding a series of events to commemorate the contribution of the Chinese to this fight and its historic legacy. 75 years on, there are new challenges, though. As multilateralism gives way to nationalist tendencies, Beijing believes the international order in place since the end of World War II is now in danger. What are the biggest challenges to multilateralism, and how dangerous is the rising right-wing tide around the world? To discuss all these issues and more, I'm joined by Professor Xiongli Li from University of International Business and Economics, also Professor Rana Mitter from University of Oxford, Professor Joseph Mahoney from East China Normal University, and later on, Takasato Wananabe, Professor Emeritus of Doshisha University. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan. First of all, welcome, gentlemen. You're from China, the U.S., and the U.K. First of all, why don't I ask each of you this question? You know, today, September the 3rd, marks the victory of War of Resistance Against Japanese Day, or VJ Day. What are your personal thoughts on this day? Rana, why don't I start with you?
I think one of the things we have to remember, Wang Guan, is the very central nature of this victory to the shaping of the world that we have today. The Asia that we know today, the world that we know today, would be very different had it not been for the joint efforts of the three great allies who fought against the Axis powers in that part of Asia's Second World War. So that is, of course, China, the United States, and the British Empire. And I think remembering how that past 75 years ago, as you said, that it came to an end, links to the present day is a really important connection. I think too few of us remember the history, and I think it does help us to have that perspective.
Joseph.
Well, you know, I think the twin sins of history, either forgetting or misremembering, where in particular the second one can lead to a type of misguided nostalgia. Both of these, you know, risk repeating history unintentionally or foolishly trying to do so. And I think that what we see today in the world is, on the one hand, some attempts to forget that history, and on the other hand, to misremember it and even have nostalgia for it. And I think we see this in strange but overlapping and negatively reinforcing ways in Japan, the United States, and elsewhere. And it feeds into a lot of the problems that we have today.
Professor Xiong in Beijing, what do you think?
And the history is always very important. And on this Victory Day, to commemorate this special day is help us to remember the history and avoid repeat of the historic tragedy. So, as we all see, the war in the history may be a very great tragedy that cannot be changed and cannot be forgotten. And the best way to face this history is to remember it and try our best to avoid repeat of such history. And that may be our priority.
You know, today there are many comments and discussions online about the significance and importance of this day and what it means to China and the rest of the world. This Twitter user, John Grimm, says, does anyone else feel like the 75th anniversary of VJ Day and the end of the World War II came and went with disconcertingly little recognition, especially since, you know, we have Nazis again and fascism is more mainstream than it has been since 1945, or maybe that's why. Well, Rana, you called China the forgotten ally. You wrote a book about it, which was very popular. Can you explain to our global viewers, especially those in the West, why did you call China the forgotten ally?
Because, Wang Guan, very briefly, I think it's fair to say that China does remain the ally amongst the Soviet Union, the United States, and the British Empire on the Allied side in World War II, whose contribution to the wider war has simply not been remembered in the wider world. I mean, China was a country that during the years of war in the 1930s, 1940s, lost over 10 million of its people, maybe even more than that. 80 million or more became refugees in their own country during that time. The roads, the rail, the economic structure of China was destroyed beyond recognition by the invasion. And yet more than 500,000 Japanese troops at their height were held down by the Chinese resistance, both of the Chinese nationalist government at the time and, of course, their allies in the Chinese Communist Party. So I think it's worth remembering that had China not resisted, let's say in the year 1938, 1 year after the fighting broke out at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing, and when many foreign observers thought that China would have to surrender to Japan, if they had not carried on that resistance, then actually the chances for the rest of the Western Allies to come in at Pearl Harbor in 1941, the Americans and British, would have been much less likely. So I think remembering that China is not just a story about Asia, but a story about the global war is a really important reorientation. And that's why I wrote that book and called it, as you have pointed out, Forgotten Ally.
Well, Rana, how much do you think that has to do with the Cold War? You know, China, the USSR has been put on the other side. It's, you know, the red world versus the free world. And, you know, China has been depicted as an adversary. Textbooks in the West rarely mentioned the fact that China was once an ally of the West, right?
I think that's fair, although it's fair to say also that things have been changing in recent years. So we can talk about major scholars in the West, such as Richard Frank in the United States and Hans van der Ven in Cambridge, who have written very extensive books in the Western Academy, giving huge amounts of detail about China's contribution to the war. But you're right, the Cold War was actually the place where the differentiation was made. I think, to be fair, it's true on all sides. America, Britain, Japan, China. We spent a lot of time thinking about our own history during those years. And of course, the Second World War was very important to those national histories. But I think in some senses, it wasn't really till maybe about 30, 40 years ago that historians started doing more global history, thinking about the influence of one country on the wider trajectory of the war. And one of the most fantastic things in recent years is that as a British historian, I have got to work much more with Chinese colleagues. Chinese colleagues I know work with Japanese colleagues, American colleagues. The study of World War II and China's role in it is now a global enterprise, not just a national enterprise.
It's very important to hear all sides of the story and to get the record straight. Thank you, Rana, over there. Joseph, let me ask you, I mean, how would you characterize China's contribution to World War II, you know, the war against fascism and aggression?
Well, I think that our colleague at Oxford is exactly correct, that there has been a lot of work done among Western scholars to try to better understand this in recent years. The problem is that, unfortunately, you know, the academic mind or the academic word doesn't have the same sort of impact that a Hollywood movie does. And more than any other you know, source material out there, what we see are films like Midway, to think of one more recently, that are framing this historical discussion. And I think that there's this broad perception that that exists in the United States and exists through American popular culture, that the U.S. somehow single-handedly or was largely responsible for winning World War I, World War II, the Cold War, and it's created this mythos, this mythology of this American greatness, this insurmountable American greatness. And the fact of the matter is, you know, it's only been in recent years that China has really tried to recover and tell the story because it needed to be told and to get out of that Cold War mindset, that Taiwan versus mainland mindset that had fractured the discussion in some respects. So I think that, you know, there's this big uphill battle at a time to tell the story at a time when places like the United States don't necessarily want to hear something positive about China's contribution and would rather simply fantasize about what they did.
Yeah, 1945 is certainly a watershed moment, the start of the end of the World War II, but unfortunately the start of the Cold War as well. Professor Xun, how do you think, as Joseph just mentioned, how do you think China can tell its story, its contribution, what it did during World War II? Do you think China's role in World War II has been, you know, hugely underrated by the Western world?
On the whole, the World War II can be divided into two major battlefields. One may be North Atlantic battlefield, and another one is Asia-Pacific battlefield. And on this Asia-Pacific battlefield, China fought against Japan for more than 8 years, and to some degree, maybe 14 years. That means among all the allied countries fighting against the fascist countries, China may be the country who have been fighting for the longest time, and China has sacrificed the most in the Asia-Pacific battlefield. And Japan's major war resources, especially the army resources, major spent on the Asian mainland, and China's role in the World War II against Japan may be unique, may be necessary for the final victory of the war.
Yeah, Rana, you studied World War II history extensively. What role do you think anti-communism played in framing the narrative of post-World War II history? And do you think anti-communism is experiencing a surge these days under the U.S. administration?
I think anti-communism, and also, to be fair, anti-Westernism, played a role in both of the blocks of the Cold War. So in the Western bloc, in United Kingdom, in the United States, there was a certain reluctance to talk about the major contributions of both the Soviet Union and China to the war effort. And in China and the Soviet Union at that time, there wasn't much contact with the West, and there was a lot of often very unthinking rhetoric which really tried to downplay the immensely important role of the Americans and the British. So I think every side had lessons to learn from each other during that period. I think that actually the major cause, and if I may say this as a historian, is actually about access to materials. The fact is that during much of the Cold War, it was very hard to go across borders. So Russian historians couldn't come to America to look at archival materials there. British historians couldn't come to China to look at the Chinese language materials there, even if they spoke the language. And the fact is that many English language scholars don't read Chinese, and vice versa. So I think we shouldn't forget the practical difficulties as well as the ideological ones. As for the present day, I think it's fair to say that today we're living in a world where actually great powers are beginning to run up against one another. I'm not sure that anti-communism, in the sense of kind of an ideological battle in the old Cold War sense, is quite the right way to think about it, because we have to understand that the Western world and China are entwined with each other in a whole variety of ways that actually don't really fit with old-fashioned styles of communism. You know, China and the US today are both major financial powers, economic powers, as well as military powers. And so, in a sense, the story of their interaction is as important as the story of the places where they are in opposition to each other. And that, I think, is very different from the anti-communist story of the Cold War. It's a new phase. We need a new way to describe it.
If it's not ideology, or it's mostly not about ideology, do you think the current rivalry or Washington's containment strategy, as many perceive, against China derive largely from, fear of China's rise, China's power? Rana?
I think I think on both sides, actually, there is a lack of willingness at times, I think, to understand the world as the other side sees it. And I think both sides could learn a great deal from each other. So both Washington and Beijing in recent years have, of course, been looking to maintain a stronger geopolitical position. I think that's very important for both of them. Both, I think, have some lessons to learn at the moment in terms of working out how those countries in the middle, how in some sense, the other actors, whether in Europe or Southeast Asia or elsewhere, are going to react both to the rise of China and the continuing presence of the United States. So, in a sense, the way I'd answer your question is to say is, we need to get away from the idea that this is about the US versus China. I'd say it's much more a battle for the hearts and minds of the rest of the world, in the West, Asia, and elsewhere. And both Washington and Beijing can do a lot more practical and positive to try and win that battle for hearts and minds.
Yeah, hopefully that will be the case. Joseph, let me turn to you. The existing world order is, to a large extent, a legacy of post-World War II power politics. Do you think that, the world architecture, the world order, is still the best arrangement to govern interstate relations right now? And do you think that the world order is under threat?
I think that we are often now talking about the emergence of a new world order. And I think at the same time, you know, many of us are worried that multilateralism is under attack, particularly from Washington, in ways that will destabilize. It's clear that multilateralism is the only way forward, the only way to mitigate dangers related to climate change, outbreaks, war, trade conflict. But I think at the same time we have to be careful because, you know, coming out of World War II, then coming out of the Cold War, the multilateralism that emerged was one in which you had one dominant power. And while multilateralism was developing, an authentic multilateralism, there was also something pseudo about it, right? Something that privileged the U.S., that privileged the U.S. dollar. So I think we're in this difficult stage where we're really finally trying to test and evolve a real, authentic multilateralism. And that legacy power from the past is resisting that change.
Professor Xun, do you think China, you know, has benefited from, you know, the post-World War II world order, and what kind of world order does China want to see right now?
First of all, I believe the world order after World War II in the past 70 years, on the whole, it is based on the basis of international justice. So, especially in the past 40 years, almost 40 years, China, on the whole, has benefited from this world order. And this world order, in political arena, maybe United Nations, and in economic arena, maybe WTO and the IMF and the World Bank, and on many other specialized fields, such as WHO. Also, all these international institutions may be progress of our human civilization. And China, has been devoting itself to the progress, improvement of all these international institutions. And in the past decades, China has benefited from these international institutions. And in the coming decades, I believe China may do more with other major countries, with other partners, such as EU, such as many countries, such as even United States, may do more to improve all these international institutions. And all in all, the basis, the cornerstone of the world order after World War II may be all these international institutions and international organizations. That cannot be ignored.
Well, Professor Xun, I want to stay with you. Ask you about China-Japan relations. You know, on this very day, we know that over the past few decades, the China-Japan relationship has experienced ups and downs. Bilateral ties entered a new era, as both sides claimed, after the two leaders met last June. But we also know that Prime Minister Abe of Japan is resigning, and he appealed oftentimes to his nationalist base. You know, for example, he visits Yasukuni Shrine often. How would you assess China-Japan relations over the past decade or so?
Frankly speaking, there are still many disputes, especially historical issue or territorial issue. There are still such disputes between our two countries, between China and Japan. But disputes may be not most dangerous. But if we just ignore the importance of the bilateral relations, that may be most dangerous. And in the past few years, to our joy, we can see both of the two countries' leaders has attached great importance to our bilateral relations. That may be very good signal for both of the two countries, even for the whole world. So, so maybe in the future, it will still a long way to the final solution of all the disputes between China and Japan. However, if we can just try our best to take our efforts to improve the bilateral relations without solution of such disputes, that may be also practical. So the most important thing is both of the two countries have the real intention to improve the bilateral relation. That may be important. And the solution of the disputes, such as territorial issues or historical issue, may be not most important. That means we can improve the bilateral relation without a solution of such disputes. Yeah.
Joseph, let me ask you. I mean, it looks like that the China-U.S. confrontation has pushed Beijing closer to Tokyo somehow. But on the other hand, there are long-simmering tensions over Hong Kong, over Diaoyu Islands, and now with the resignation of Prime Minister Abe, there are certainly uncertainties. How do you look at China-Japan relations going forward?
You know, I think that the differences between China and Japan, there are some that are clearly very sensitive, right, in terms of how Japan remembers the war, the extent to which they mobilize nationalism to potentially mischievous ends. But in fact, I don't think the problems are that big if we really look at things. I think issues like the Diaoyu could be resolved relatively peacefully. I think the real problem is that Japan has become kind of stuck in time, both with the middle income trap, but also its inability to foster a truly independent foreign policy, given the legacy of the U.S. as a guarantor of Japan militarily that comes out of World War II. And as a result, Japan constantly has to be looking over its shoulder towards the United States instead of looking squarely in the eye of Beijing to work out problems, to work out trade, to work out other issues. So this is where I think the real fly in the ointment, so to speak, is in contemporary China-Japan-U.S. relations.
Right. This is a very fresh perspective, Joseph. But we know that Japan's ruling LDP will hold a leadership election on September 14th to elect Mr. Abe's successor. You know, do you think that new leadership can somehow change the institutional design that you mentioned? For example, relying or perhaps over-relying on the U.S. as a guarantor, as a strategic policy maker?
I think it's going to be very difficult for anyone to do anything in the short term. Everyone, you know, we talk about sort of a pseudo-multilateralism. Everyone in the world right now is kind of on pause and on eggshells, waiting to see what happens with the U.S. presidential election, to see if there's going to be some major shift in U.S. foreign policy that's going to either take things back to some sort of reasonable way of doing things or continue down a dark road. At the same time, you know, I don't think China is very excited about Japan developing its own military abilities so that it could become more independent of U.S. foreign policy, even though that would probably benefit China-Japan relations over the long term.
Professor Hsiung, how do you look at you know, China-Japan relations with the resignation of Prime Minister Abe and the new leadership election?
Now, according to the domestic political situation in Japan, the chief secretary in the past more than 7 years in Abe's administration, Mr. Suga Yoshihide, may be most possible to be the next prime minister. And if Mr. Suga can be successor of Mr. Abe, in my opinion, on the whole, Abe's foreign policy and the China policy may be continued. And as we have seen in the past nearly 8 years, Mr. Suga may be a very good subordinate to Mr. Abe. In this way, we can see it's very possible for Mr. Suga to continue Abe's foreign policy, even China policy. And if Mr. Suga can be the next prime minister, can be successor of Mr. Abe, and I'm very convinced to see more improvement in China-Japan relations. And even Mr. Kishida can be successor of Mr. Abe. On the whole, Mr. Kishida has ever been foreign minister in Abe's administration. So in this way, there may be not too much difference between Kishida and Abe's foreign policy. And in this way, we can see, in this perspective, Sino-Japan relationship in the coming years may keep stable. Yeah.
You know, Joseph, on this very day, the VJ Day, you know, the day where Japan was defeated during World War II, many countries, many commentators are talking about multilateralism. But do you think they're all talking about the same thing? Or does multilateralism have different meanings in different parts of the world?
Well, I think generally speaking, we're talking about the same thing, but I don't think we're valuing it the same way. And I think that, as I tried to say earlier, that you know we have almost started talking about nostalgically this multilateralism that took place over the last 30 years. You know, we can talk about that China, you know, having this incredible growth and development, Deng Xiaoping's old Peace and Development or the Trend of the Times, and you know, growing through the WTO and the various other international organizations. But at the same time, you know, we had not a Cold War, not a World War, but we had the War on Terror. We had the Jasmine revolutions. We had the color revolutions. We had unrest in many places that don't look nostalgically back at that time, that don't look back at that as a period where you had a real valid multilateralism. We look back at what happened in '97 with the Asian financial crisis, sparked in part by, well, not to go through that history, but again in 2008 with the U.S. instigated global financial crisis. So, you know, I think that we have had this growing multilateralism that's been growing maybe as far back as World War I and the League of Nations through fits and starts, and it hasn't really yet emerged yet, and I think that that as it's trying to do so again, it's again facing tremendous headwinds.
Sure. The concept of multilateralism certainly evolved over the decades. We understand that we have Professor Takasato Watanabe from Doshisha University. Professor Watanabe, what are your thoughts as a Japanese scholar on this very day that is known as VJ Day here in China?
In Japan, you see, more than half of the Japanese people, they are very sorry, or they must apologize to you, including myself, of course, about invasion of China mainland and other Asian countries. But Mr. Abe, the Prime Minister now, who will be changed very soon, and his follower, Mr. Suga, and some ministers, you see, they never admit the invasion of Japan and Japanese army upon the China and other Asian nations. So this is true, so that even if you see Mr. Abe remove his position, but if the Suga is elected as the next Prime Minister through the due process, we are very sorry that we can't expect so good things from their activities. So we are very worried about that, and we are thinking that we should change the Japanese atmosphere of the politics.
We have about 40 seconds left, sir. What will be your prediction on the future of China-Japan relations?
I have been, you see, composing some friendship association between Japan and China, and the people are for our side, but people are not given the right information through the mass media, which is influenced by Mr. Abe and his colleagues. This is a very sorry thing for me.
Alrighty. I'm sorry for the initial technical difficulties. I want to thank all of our guests from China, from Japan, the US, and UK. That would do it for this edition of Dialogue. I want to thank all of our viewers for tuning in. I'm Wang Guan in Beijing. Thank you for watching.